Hello and welcome to the Collective Masters live class. I'm Vinnie Pagano, and we're going to be doing some drum recording. I'm an audio engineer, and I have done plenty of recording, vocal recording, drum recording, you name it, I've recorded it. I've worked with a lot of record labels, indie labels, with artists like Joey Badass and Anderson .Paak. And I'm going to teach you guys today some of the things that I've learned through some of my recording sessions. We're going to start with a pretty complicated drum recording setup that I would do anytime I'm in the studio, but we'll break it down to make it a little bit simpler for those of you who are recording at home and maybe don't have a $30,000 budget for microphones and stands and everything. So without any further ado, let's take a look at our drum setup, and we'll take a look at some of the microphones that we're using. Before we actually even get into that, the most important thing that we could do for any session, whether it's just recording drums or anything else, is prep work. And I have a pretty simple little list here, and this is my mic input list. And basically what I have written down here is all of the individual microphones that I'm using and what they're going to be recording and where they're going to be routed. As we look at this setup, right now we're running 11 different microphones, and that means 11 microphones, 11 cables, 11 inputs. Things can start to get pretty complicated. So by having a simple sheet of paper telling us where things should be plugged in and where they have to go, it could save us a lot of trouble in the long haul. And before we get into this, if anybody has any questions for everyone at home, if you have questions, just send them in online, and we'll get to the recording questions at the halfway point. We're going to start off with the recording and spend the back half of this trying to mix our drums and getting everything to sound right. So the first two microphones we'll take a look at are going to be over here on our kick drum. Right now I have two microphones on the kick drum. There's a kick in and a kick out. Both of these, for this purpose, is going to be our AKG D112. This mic is pretty well catered to kicks, as it was basically just made for that. If you're going to go with something else, just make sure you're going with some sort of large diaphragm microphone. Typically, a dynamic microphone is going to be the way to go. As we look at our two different mics, we have our kick-in mic, which is roughly in the middle of the kick. I have it more so towards the front, pointed right at the beater of the pedal. This particular mic is going to get a little bit more of the snap without as much of the boom, whereas our outside mic is going to get a little bit more of the boom, not as much of the kick. So when placing this exterior mic, what we want to be paying attention to is the two main things: the distance from the head of the mic and also where it is relative to center. As you go inside the drum head versus outside, the interior is going to be a little bit more high-pitched, where the exterior is going to be lower. So this applies to basically everything that is a circle, right? So all our drums, all our cymbals, same concept. Closer to the center is going to be a little bit lower, and then higher on the outside. So usually with my outside kick, I like to go a little bit more towards the outside to get a little bit of that lower tone. Next ones we'll talk about. Another two mic setup for one drum is our snares. So with our snare drum, we basically have two microphones. We're using an SM57 and an SM58. You could use 258s or 257s. They're going to have some minor differences, but both should work pretty well for your snare drum. When we're placing these microphones, what we want to try to do, I like to take the diaphragm of the microphone and place it just over the rim of the drum. Place it about 3 inches off of the drum, and then angle it kind of towards the center, maybe a little more towards the outside. And as we do our bottom mic, we're going to do basically the same thing in reverse. Very important. We want to try to get like a pincer where they're both the same distance from the head of the drum, and they're both at the same angle. And what this is going to do is it's going to prevent most phase issues that we could run into when we're combining these signals. Next, we'll talk about our rack toms. So with our rack toms, we're going to use these MD421s. This is just a great drum and percussion microphone. Anytime I have to record any type of percussion, whether it's drums, cowbells, congas, whatever it is, this is a great go-to mic for that. So for these, we want to be thinking the same concept as we were thinking with the snare drum, where we're going to put it over the edge, over the rim, and kind of point it down towards the center of the drum. Same thing is going to apply for our floor tom. Next one we got is our hi-hats. So for the hi-hats, we're going to use this 451, and we're basically just pointing it straight down. Again, when we're talking about placement towards the center or outside, it's just a matter of pitch. If you go over the bell of your cymbals, you're going to get a much plunkier sound. So if you need something to be a little bit tighter, you can go with that. As far as distance, I usually keep it pretty close without making sure that the movement of the cymbals is not going to be, hitting the microphone. So once we've got those close mics set up, we could take a look at our overheads. So far all the mics we've talked about, we're using a close miking technique where we're trying to capture the direct sound of that particular instrument as cleanly as possible. And that's why we've been placing everything so close. What this is going to do is help us get a cleaner signal of that particular instrument, but B, also help us to reduce the bleed from the rest of the drum kit. Drums can be hard to mic up because, it's not just isolated pieces, it's a whole kit altogether. So we've done this with these close mics, but that can sound kind of sterile. It'll sound like a bunch of different elements as opposed to a live kit. So now we start to use some more distant mics. So we have our left and right overheads, and these are going to be 414s, AKG 414s. These are great all-around mics. You can use them for just about anything, and they're going to work pretty well. They have a lot of different options on them. We could change the polar patterns. There's pads on there, and we can also apply filters to these mics, so they're very versatile. But for this placement, what we're going to be doing is trying to capture the overall drum kit with our overheads. What's important about these overheads that we want to be thinking about is that we currently don't have any microphones on our cymbals. So these overheads are also going to act as our cymbal mics. So there's a lot of different schools of thought as to how you would approach placement on your overhead mics. I personally like to keep them a little bit lower and a little bit wider. And that's because I'm treating them more as cymbal mics as opposed to kit mics. I'm not really trying to capture a big, loud sound most of the time. Depends on the style of music. If we're going for maybe a more indie style drum where it's a little bit, grungier and not super clean, maybe we could just use these overheads a little further away, perhaps a little tighter to capture more of the kit and maybe less of our cymbals. Now, the big key to our overhead mics is that we're doing an overhead left and an overhead right. So when we record these different tracks, what we have to do is make sure we pan one left and one to the right. The panning is what's going to give us some space and some room and really some life to our kit. Now, the question will come up, well, which way do we pan which one? How do we know, is that the left or is that the left? Well, there's a couple of different ways you could look at it. You could look at it from an audience perspective, where somebody who's sitting in the audience will look at the drum kit, and you'll see that you have your overhead left is over here and your overhead right is over there. Or you could take a look at it from a drummer's perspective. So as if you're the drummer, which if you're a drummer, this is probably going to make more sense to you. So you have your overhead left and your overhead right. Whether you go drummer's perspective or audience perspective is more of a preference thing. The only consideration you have to make with this is like you have to be consistent with that and you have to be aware that you're doing that. And what I mean by that is if you use some room microphones, you're going to want to pan them in the same manner. So if you have room microphones that we have a left and a right, and we have overheads that are left and right, we want to make sure they're either both drummer perspective or both audience perspective. If we start flipping things, things might get weird and phase issues might happen. So your safest bet is to just make sure whatever you're doing, do it consistently. So that's our overheads. Moving along to our room mics. So there's a whole bunch of different ways we could do room microphones. The technique that I'm going to show you is not super popular, but I'm a big fan of it. I think it makes a lot more sense with modern recording and modern tracking. So first I'll explain the old way of doing room mics. And really, what are room mics? So we talked about our overheads kind of being there to capture the whole kit and, you know, the cymbals mostly. But then we have room mics, which are not really there to record the kit. They're there to record the reflections of the room that the kit is in. So yes, you're recording the drums, but you're recording the space that it's in. So if you have a very big and reflective space, if you're in a place where like you're standing in the studio and you're listening to the drums and you're like, wow, this sounds great in here, then maybe you want to go with some room mics. The standard way of doing room mics is to just take a pair of microphones, ideally two of the same type of microphone, and you kind of just want to place them like far out in the room. So in a room like this, you go like far back in the left, far back in the right. And it always kind of depends. Whatever room you're going to be in is going to dictate where your room microphones are going to go. I found that with a lot of the recording that we're doing these days, we don't really necessarily need that much space on our drums. And if we do, a lot of the times we can add that with plugins. We can all do that. We can do all of that in the box. We can do that after the fact. And a lot of the times I end up just dumping those far room mics. So I wanted to try to find something to capture a little bit of the room without necessarily being such a big splashy space. So this technique I've landed on, this is called a Bloomline pair. So what we have here are two ribbon microphones. I'm using the Royer R121s. And basically what we're doing, we have these two microphones that have a figure eight polar pattern, meaning they're picking up in front of the microphone and behind the microphone, but not on the sides. So I have them really close together, inverted on each other. And instead of pointing them both at our kit, I have them tilted 45 degrees both ways. And so as we look at this, our top mic is over here to the right, and our bottom mic is over here to the left. And so this Bloomline pair is going to capture that space, but also space over here and space over there. So it'll capture the space in front of the mics, but also behind the mics. Now, when we're setting this Bloomline pair up, I like to get somewhere between like 6 or 8 feet off the drum kit and about 4 or 5 feet off the ground. Again, your space is going to kind of dictate this. Depends on the room you're in, and you're going to pretty much have to just do a little bit of guess and check when you set it up. But the key to this is the alignment. And you might think like, okay, if I'm trying to get some room mics going, I should be right in front of our kit. But that's going to cause a problem. The problem with that is that this is what the center of our image is going to be. And what it's going to end up doing, since our snare drum is off to the right in this case, it's now going to place our image off to the right. So what we've done with these room mics is we're lining it up right off of the kick and the snare. We want the kick and the snare to be in the center of our image. They're really going to be driving the beat, and very, very, very rarely are we going to be panning either of these elements. Very important to keep them down the center. So what we'll do when we record, we'll record all of these levels pretty hot, but we're probably going to adjust our room mics to come down quite a bit. Maybe our overheads will come down quite a bit as well. So this is the basic drum setup. Now, right now we have 11 microphones on our kit. You could do more, you could do less. If you're going to do less, you don't necessarily need two kick drum mics. You don't necessarily need 2 snare drum mics. You don't necessarily need your toms mic'd up. If I had to break it down to a simpler setup, like most of the time, people at home might only have an interface that can take, say, 4 inputs. If you can only take 4 inputs, I would probably end up doing a kick, snare, and then overheads. If you have 8, then you could start to add in these extra layers, right? Now, the question might be like, okay, well, other than, do we have the gear to mic these up? What's the advantage of having a bunch of different microphones versus just a couple of microphones? Really, the short answer is control. The more individual mics we have and the more individual elements we have on their own tracks, the more control we're going to have in the mix. If we only have 2 microphones, or 3 microphones, let's say we have a kick and our overheads, and we go to listen to our drums and the snare's too loud. We can't really turn up the snare because we don't have an individual mic to do that. Or if the kick's too loud, we have to start doing weird things with the EQ, so we don't have as much control over it. Again, there's kind of a couple different schools of thought on this. I tend to lean towards more mics. Whenever I can, more mics, because I like to have some more control after the fact. But if you have a good drummer, and if you're a good drummer, you can control those dynamics, those volumes on your own. And then it might not be as important to have that control after the fact. But whatever you find to be good for you is really going to be ultimately the best way to record. And again, I like to go with more microphones for more control. So before we actually get into recording these, let's talk about like the 2 most important things to getting a good recording. It's not the microphones and it's not the placement. The 2 most important things are going to be the performance, and that's the most important by far. If the drummer is drumming their heart out and they're giving a good performance, it's probably going to sound good. So performance is really important, and the next most important thing is like, what do the drums already sound like? And what I mean by that is like, do you have the right snare drum? Is the kick tuned right? Is the toms too ringy? So you want to make sure that like when you're in the room and you're listening to the drums have to sound good in that room before you start to record it. If you record a ringy tom and you go to mix it, you're going to record a ringy tom. And it's always going to be most beneficial to fix any of the issues that you run into from the source. So like I said, tuning drums, super important. Having your kick drum tuned in with your bass, most importantly, but also, you know, your other elements, your keys and any other low elements in your track, that's going to go a long way into making that sound so much better later. If you have drums that are kind of too ringy or wobbly, you can tighten up your resonant heads. Like usually having I'll have a drum key on me to kind of tighten these up in the space. Another trick is by putting things on the drum heads themselves. You could put, like right now I have some gaff tape on here, which is just kind of standard audio engineer tape that you use for everything. You put a little tape on the head to kind of dull it down a little bit. Actually, in our kick drum, we have a big pillow in there to deaden the kick drum a little bit so it's not too boomy and, you know, in a smaller room. Another thing you can put on top of the drums, they have moon gels, which are little pieces of like silicone or gel that are made for this particular purpose. But if you don't want to be fancy, you can like throw your wallet on a snare drum to tighten it up a little bit. I've seen people throw a hat on a snare drum, and sometimes that's just going to get you the sound that you need. So once you get your drums sounding good in the room that they're in, you can get ready to record. So I'm gonna go ahead and get my drummer Seamus up here. How's it going? Thank you for drumming for us today. We're basically just going to go through the process of checking some levels, and then we're just gonna record some basic 8 or 16 bar loops to get this stuff all recorded. So the first thing we want to do is get a line check. And I've already done this before we start our presentation, but the idea of a line check is to make sure that each of these microphone signals is going into a channel that you've set it up for in your DAW and on your mixer or whatever, your recording console or whatever you're using. Then what we want to do is catch levels on everything. So we're going to set the levels based on how loud the drummer's drumming. So typically, this is going to be a two-person job. If you're doing recording at home, it's going to be a lot easier to do this once you have another person. Otherwise, you're going to have to like press record, run to the kit, hit a few, go back, check if everything's okay. So you don't want to do that. So we have two people here doing this, and that's how it's going to make your life a lot easier. So we're going to check our levels, and we're going to just make sure that everything is coming in at a healthy level, but not clipping. And clipping is overloading the channels. So basically, we're going to try to keep everything more or less in the green. A little bit of yellow is okay. Red, not good. So let's move over here. When we're talking about getting levels for our recordings, we need to have some sort of audio interface that has enough channels for all the microphones that we're recording, and then we also need to have some sort of microphone preamps. So basically, the idea is that microphones are at like a very low level, so we need to use preamps or preamplifiers to get that microphone level up to a working level that we call line level. So right here we have this Midas recording mixing console, and this is just going to be acting as our mic pre's. So what I'm going to have Seamus do is basically play some basic notes, something easy, but also hitting all the different pieces of the kit. This way we can make sure that none of our levels are clipping. I've already gone ahead and turned up the gain on some of these, so we'll just do a double check to make sure everything's all good. And we'll see how everything goes with that. Now, there's two ways that we can kind of think about setting our levels. The way I like to do it, I like to set my recording levels more or less the same across the board. meaning my kick drum is going to be kind of in the green, kind of in the yellow. My snare is going to be in the green, in the yellow. Every microphone in the green, in the yellow. This ensures that we have a nice healthy signal that we can work with after the fact. Another way to think about it is to record the balance, to record the mix. And what that means is that each of these input gains is going to be adjusted to make the kit sound like the right balance. When we have everything all going green and yellow, when we go to initially listen to that, there's going to be some way balance issues, right? We're going to have like our snare is going to be too loud, our overheads are going to be way too loud. So we'll adjust that after the fact. But especially like if you're recording in your own space and you're always using the same drums and the microphones are always in the same place, you can start getting a little bit, a little more fine-tuned with how you set your gains. So you can set your kick to be as loud as it is, but then your input gain can adjust how loud your overheads are. So when you record it and you go to listen to it without pushing any faders, the balance is pretty good. So that's another way to look at it, and it always depends on what's preferred for you. So what we're going to do is go ahead. I'm just going to hit record on my DAW. I have an individual track set up for each layer. And then we're just going to have Seamus play some notes. And all the while, I'm going to be taking a look at my levels, my input levels, and make sure nothing's clipping. So can you just go ahead and play a beat for us? Okay, cool. So everything looks pretty good over here. My levels are pretty healthy. One thing you want to be aware of is when you're recording with other people, like especially with drummers, a lot of the time when you go to do just a little level check, they're just going to kind of, oh, hey, here's some drums. But then when they go to play, they really, really smash the drums and they really play. So what's going to happen a lot of the time is your actual levels are going to be a lot hotter than the levels you set for your little line check. So you want to make sure that you go a little bit lower than you would normally want to. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and let's have you play. Let's go ahead and have you play just like an 8-bar beat. Make sure you hit some toms, do like a fill at the end, and make sure we get some cymbals in there as well. Whenever you're ready. All right. So, looking at my recording, realized we just had an issue here, and it looks like one of my microphones is not working. So, what I'm going to do is try to just check out what's going on, and our snare top microphone is not working. So, this is a good opportunity for us to figure out how to troubleshoot this. So whenever we're doing troubleshooting procedures, we want to try to start from the source, follow it down until it gets to our destination. So what I'm going to do is just kind of hop over here. I'm going to play with this cable a little bit. I'm just going to see if we get signal there. And I felt the microphone click. And now if we're looking at our snare top signal, we're getting it. And cool. So let me have you hit the snare again. Beautiful. So maybe just from hitting the drums a little bit, the cable came loose, no big deal. As long as we catch it early, now we can go ahead and do our recording again. So I'm just gonna start this from the top. So let me have you again, just record 8 bars, 16 bars, whatever you're feeling. Okay, cool. And so just from that take, I can already tell Seamus is a little more warmed up, and he already started hitting the drums a little bit harder. So I did some more level adjustments. Now, if you are in a position where you can do your level adjustments on the fly like that, just make sure that you're not going to use that take, because now we're going to have a take where I adjusted the input volume. So now there's going to be a level difference halfway through the recording, which is less than ideal. So again, from the top, we're just going to do a couple of takes of this, and then we'll get on to the mixing. Let me have you go again. All right, cool. And then just give me one more round and just make sure you hit a little bit of that floor tom for me, please. Thank you. All right, our tom's clipped again, so we'll do one more take, please. All right, beautiful. That'll do it. All right, thanks. I appreciate the help, Seamus. Good drumming. All right, fantastic. So now that we have some drums recorded, we'll move over to the mixing portion of this. But just before we get into that, I wanted to note one more thing. One thing we didn't cover here was having a headphone mix. And it can be a little complicated to do something like that without knowing the exact setup of your studio and the gear that you have. How you set up your headphone mix or your cue mix is going to be dependent on what gear you have available to you, what audio interfaces you have, if you're using hear back units, how many outputs you have. So it's going to be very dependent on what you have going on. Another consideration is the DAW that you're using. Right now I'm recording with Ableton. You could use Logic, Pro Tools, whatever DAW you're comfortable with. That's fine, but the cue setup and the headphone setup is going to be slightly varied depending on which one you're using. So do we have any questions online? All right, cool. So then we'll just move right on to the mixing portion. All right. Sound should be good. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take our third take. So I'm just going to delete those previous takes, which will already be saved in case I need them. Depending on the DAW you're using, it does save, Ableton does save your takes in backup take lanes. Pro Tools, you could playlist your different takes. So if we delete stuff, we can usually go back and get it. But for right now, we'll just work with what we have here. So what I'm going to do is, First, I'm going to try to kind of roughly find our tempo. Let's just do a quick sound check. Can we get the master volume up, please? Okay, cool. So what I'm going to do first, I kind of want to find the tempo. And with a live drummer not playing to a metronome, I'm not expecting it to be super locked on. But if we do have to do any type of editing, we're definitely going to want to make sure our tempo is at least in the ballpark. Generally speaking, whenever recording drummers, I like to have them drum along to a click track. And even if they're not dead on it, it should keep things pretty close again, which will make editing a lot easier. So to find our tempo, basically, I'm just going to go ahead to our first transient, which is like the first note where we see our audio waveform kind of jump. I'm going to cut all the air before that. And I'm going to then slide all of those tracks to the front. I'm going to then make sure, so in Ableton, there's an option to warp the audio. You could do this, again, in most DAWs, there's some sort of audio warping. I'm just going to make sure it's off. And a quick little trick to get the tempo is to just kind of slide our tempo until we start to see our transients hitting grid points. So we could take a look and maybe check this out. So it's definitely going to be slower than that. Cool, so now I'm looking at my kick and I'm seeing that we have these double hits at the front. Is generally going to be the top of the bar. And so now our click is pretty close. Right, and again, without the drummer playing to a click, it's not going to be dead on, so we don't need to worry about it too much. Now, we talked about this a little bit before. The first issue that we kind of have to deal with is the balance is a little off. We recorded everything hot. We recorded all our levels fairly high, so we didn't record the balance. So what we're going to want to do is adjust the different volumes of our different tracks. Sometimes the easiest way to do that is to just start with your kick and blend everything else in. So what we'll do, right now I have all of our different tracks or all of our different microphones are all on different tracks. But what we're also going to do is start to bust things together. And I'm going to do this as I'm going through and kind of adjusting our volumes. So I'm going to turn all the volumes down. And I'm going to first group our two kick tracks together. So what's grouping? I'm basically just taking, you could do, it's called grouping or bussing. Basically, I'm taking these two kick layers and I'm summing them together into one track so we have one fader to control both volumes. Now, it's going to be important because we're taking our kick in mic and our kick out mic, which are two flavors of the same instrument, and we're going to try to find a balance between the two. And once we find that balance, we want to maintain that balance. So I'm going to start with our kick in. Let's go ahead and just loop this. And so while I'm listening to this, especially for everyone at home wondering why are we miking a kick in and a kick out, let's listen to the difference between the kick in and the kick out. So here's our kick in mic. And here's our kick out mic. In, out. So we notice that our kick in is a bit tighter, a little clappier while our kick out is definitely a little bit boomier, and we're getting some of those lower frequencies with that kick out mic. So I'm just going to try to balance these two different timbres together to get one decent sounding kick. Now, another thing that we can do, once we get these balanced together, we can start to address the issue of bleed. So right now, when we play our kick, we can still hear our other instruments. We're still hearing the snare and sometimes the cymbals and the overheads. So if we want to get rid of that, we can use a pretty simple trick. We can use what's called a gate. A gate is a dynamic processor, and basically the way a gate works is when the gate is closed, there's no audio signal going through. And when we have an audio signal that reaches above a certain volume, the gate opens and we can hear the signal. So what that's going to look like in practice, let's rename this to our kick group. We can go in here and I'll put this just on our kick bus. And we'll start with our threshold all the way up. So the audio should be below the threshold. So when I press play, we don't hear anything. As we start to lower this threshold, we can see that and hear that only our kick is coming through, and all those quieter signals that were bleeding through are now out. So we're going to use this process, and you can use this pretty much on everything, especially with toms, right? A lot of the time, if you're miking up toms, toms aren't throughout the whole track like a kick is or like a snare is. Those toms, for the most part on the track, basically just act as room mics for all of the other microphones. So what we want to do is cut those down when the tom's not coming through. So again, we're on our kick. And what I like to do is put a limiter on my kick. Typically, I'll use FabFilter's Pro L2. And really the first step of mixing is to get the levels right. And the reason I'm going to use this limiter is to get my kick to be a consistent level. I usually set my kick around -10, and then as I go through the rest of my elements of my track, I'm always thinking relative to the kick. So as we start to add in other elements, if I'm like, oh, my kick is too low, I'm going to not turn up my kick. That means everything else is too loud. So we're going to set our kick as our anchor point. Right, and then again, I'm just going to make sure, so once I hit that limiter, I know that it's not going to exceed that volume, and then I could set that group track to -10, and now I have my consistent kick. We'll get to more of like setting the timbre of the kick a little bit later, but now that we have a consistent volume, we can start to blend in our other elements. When we get to our snare, I'm doing the same thing as I did with my kick. I'm going to group them together. And what we'll do is find the balance between the two snare elements first. So there's our snare top and our snare bottom. So our snare bottom's a bit snappier, we get more of that snare, and our snare top is a little bit punchier. I'm going to make sure that I'm going to turn my delay compensation on to keep all of the tracks in line. When I'm recording, I want to make sure my delay compensation is off, so when we're monitoring things, they're in real time. But when we start to mix, these different plugins add latency, so we want to add our delay compensation on to make sure the latency is not an issue. Another thing we want to check while we're going through this is phase coherence. So you can use some sort of utility, or a lot of plugins just have this on the output to flip the phase. And when I have my two snare mics, I'm just going to go phase in, phase out on one of them, and see if one or the other sounds better. So it sounds like they were pretty much in phase from the start. And I do like the balance as is. So I'll take the group track and blend it in. Cool. So that's going to be good there. I'm going to then take my rack and floor toms. Actually, let's go ahead and throw a gate on our snare as well, just for good measure. It's not really bothering me so much in this particular case, but we'll be able to hear a pretty significant difference. Another cool thing that gates allow you to do is with the release, you can actually control how tight your different drum elements are or how punchy they are. So you can kind of change the amplitude envelope just by messing with the gates as well. All right, cool. So let's get into our rack tom and our floor tom. I'm gonna go ahead and pan these apart. Usually just putting like a rack tom to the left and a floor tom to the right. If you have a second rack tom, you could put it in the middle. And it gives you that kind of across the stereo image movement when there's fills and things like that. So again, I'm gonna put some gates on here on the individual layers. I'm going to go ahead and do this with them soloed out. Okay, so that's pretty close. Cool. So now we have those different tom elements with a little bit of movement on them. And if we feel like our gate is a little too tight, we can use the release or the hold to kind of hold the gate open a little bit longer, or we can adjust the floor. Basically what that's going to do is it's going to tell the gate, instead of removing the volume completely, we can just pull it down a lot. So maybe you do want a little bit of the bleed for some flavor. Maybe you don't. That's up to you on the track that you're working on. Let's move on to our overheads. Again, I'm going to group these together, and like we said before, we're going to pan them apart from each other, left, right. I'm going to go ahead and solo those out. Typically with overheads, and again, it's going to depend on how you mic things up, but for this kind of setup, we decided to put our overheads a little bit closer to try to capture more of the cymbals, less of the rest of the drums. So what we could do as we're going through this is we can take an EQ and put a low cut filter on our overheads to remove some of those lower drum elements to capture a little bit more splash. So just a basic low cut here just to clean up the signal. And then I'm going to blend that in. And we'll extend our loop a little bit so we can hear the splash. Cool. And then we can go to our room mics. Same concept as our overheads. We're going to group them together. I'm going to turn them up together. One's panned left, one's panned right. And then we're going to turn the group down. And then we're just going to kind of blend this in. So if we solo out our room mics, these are pretty tight room mics, right? We don't have a lot of distance on them, and that's what I was going for. And what we could then do with these mics is use some like compression and EQ to give us a little bit more flavor. So let's do that really quick. I'm just going to heavily compress these, just using the stock glue compressor. Fast attack, kind of slower release, 4:1 ratio. Really just compress them a lot. But I'm gonna bypass this to set the makeup gain. Typically when you use compressors aren't really there to make things louder. They're there to reduce the dynamic range. So when you set a compressor, you want to try to make the makeup gain, you adjust the makeup gain to make it equal to the signal before you put the compressor on it. So what I'll do is bypass the compressor. And put it in. So now the only difference we're hearing is not one in volume, but one in compression. So we'll set that up. Again, I'll put just a little low cut filter on there. And again, we can just fade this in. Cool. And then we can adjust that as we need to. Again, we can go ahead and check the phase on these to make sure that our phase is in coherence with the rest of our track. So I'm just going to put a utility on the room group. I'm thinking it's a little better with it in. So we'll pull it down a little bit, keep the phase flipped on our overheads, and then we're going to throw our hi-hat in here. Now we're getting a lot of the hi-hat from the overhead, so I'm definitely going to gate this and cut out some of the low end. And blend it in. And then I have a pretty decent balance. And the biggest difference that you're going to get when you're, as far as like increasing your sound quality when you're recording your drums, the biggest and most important, and this is mixing in general, is the balance, right? Volumes and panning of everything. It should be like one of the quicker parts of the process, but it's going to be probably the most noticeable. So now that we've got our balance pretty good, we'll throw a couple of effects on here, and I'll show you guys some quick tricks and some really good plugins to get your drums sounding tight really quick. So the number one plugin that I absolutely love anytime I'm mixing drums is going to be Neutron from Isotope. And so Neutron is a plugin suite. And basically that means that there are EQs in there, it has compressors, exciters, sculptors, all these different things built into this one plugin. And it allows you to really tailor your specific sounds to whatever instruments you're using. So we can just dig through some of these presets. Like we already have a bunch of kick presets and snare presets, and we can go through this and see how everything sounds. So like using just this 909 chest pressure setting, it really tightened up our drums and gives us some pretty decent low end. Let's just do the same thing with the snare. Now again, when you're adding these plugins, you want to watch the input volume versus the output volume. So I'm going to go ahead and just check my Neutron on my kick, and it's definitely a bit louder. Cool, and then let's check Neutron on the snare. And just listen as I go through some of these presets, you can hear what drastic differences we get. All right, so I'm gonna land with this preset, and what I really wanna try to do is add a little bit of reverb to this. And snare reverb is as old as recording, and it's gonna just give a little bit more splash to your snares. So let's go ahead and add on, let's use Arturia's Rev Plate. Really digging this plate reverb for most things, but they are pretty nice on snares. So what I'm gonna do is just start with the wet dry knob blend all the way down, and then just start blending in. Right, so you can hear it getting really splashy. So I'm gonna pull it back a little bit. And I'm also gonna adjust the decay time on this to make it so that the reverb's not crashing into the reverb and crashing into the reverb. So we'll tighten up the decay time to make the reverb tail a little bit shorter so it's not as messy. Cool, so I'm gonna leave that there for now. Then we'll just kind of go through, throw some more neutrons on here. Let's try a tom preset, see how that lands. Cool, I'm good with that. As for overheads, I don't really feel like we need to get as crazy and use something like Neutron. We could, but really we just need some light compression to this. And I'll just use a regular compressor, go with like a faster attack, faster release. 4:1 ratio is a good starting point. And with the overheads, I'll just use a little bit of EQ to boost up some of the high end on that so our cymbals and our hats come out a little bit more. And cut a little bit from the low end so it's not so snappy with our snare and our kick. As far as our rooms, we did some EQ on this, but let's boost up that high end. Cool. And then our hi-hat, we'll use a Neutron, but I'm not expecting too big of a change here. All right, and now things are starting to sound a bit tighter. Now the big trick to make everything really sound good is to group it all together. So now we have one big drum group. And there's a lot of ways that we can affect our whole drum group to make it really just pop and give it some aggression. Adding some saturation, parallel saturation, so blending in some saturation. Compression, even a little EQ. All of these things can be really helpful. What I'm going to do is use an audio effect rack in Ableton to create a little bit of reverb. I'll use kind of like a smaller reverb setting, and I'm going to take this Pro R, put it in an audio effect rack, and use these different chains as different parallel layers to add in some extra spice to our drums. So we're gonna have our reverb layer. We'll add in a dry layer so we have some contrast. And then I'm going to add in a layer of compression using the SSL LMC. The LMC is a remake of an analog compressor that was built into the old SSL consoles, and it's great for a lot of stuff, but this one was built in and used for drums to give the drums a little more sizzle. So we'll use the plugin to do the same thing. So I'm going to start by muting out my other layers. I'm going to check out my LMC layer. And already you can hear just much more aggression with this compression. So that's pretty good where it's at. I'll turn that down. Let me check our reverb. Kind of sounds like a distant room. That's cool. So now we'll start with our dry level. Blend in a little bit of the reverb. And then blend in a little bit of the LMC. And then you balance those together to get what you feel is ultimately the best blend. Then the next thing I'll do, and the last thing we'll do with these, is add neutron to the drum bus. And this is one of my favorite tricks to save a lot of time and get a really good sound. If you go into your presets, and they have a lot of different drum bus presets, and you could use these for like a straight up better drum sound like we're about to do here, or there's a bunch of different like effects where they have like filtered down drums that you could use for breakdowns and whatever it is that you need in the track that you're working on. I'm gonna go with some mega drums, and it's definitely gonna get a bit louder, so I'm gonna turn down my master a little bit. And night and day difference, and it really just tightens up the drums by adding some EQ and compression. And what you can do, and what I highly recommend you do, anytime you're using something like Neutron or really any plugin, yeah, the presets might work really well, but it's always good to know how these presets work and why they work. So what you can do is go to these different layers and say, okay, they're using a transient shaper, or okay, they're using an exciter, or okay, what are the compressor settings? And you could figure out those different things to recreate your own kind of presets with this, or even to just dial in the stuff that they already have. So and that's the basics of some drum mixing. And you can go through, once you you want to start on the smaller levels, at the individual track levels, and as you're going through, you can start to like go back to the earlier stages to readjust these things. So if I'm mixing my drum bus and I realize that like, maybe my kick's a little too much now, maybe I pull some of my other elements down, or oh, there's too much hi-hat, I want to try to figure out where that is, and I can go and adjust those earlier settings. A lot of the time when you do this kind of like bus effects, especially bus compression, you're going to start to bring out things that were really quiet on the individual layers. So you're going to start to hear things that you didn't hear before, and sometimes you're going to hear problems that you didn't hear before. So once you can figure that out, you can start to go back and adjust your different layers. All right, that's about it for the drum mixing. Do we have any questions? No questions? All right, cool. Well, thanks a lot, guys, for tuning in. I hope you learned a few good tricks. We have private lessons. If you want to get into some more drum mixing and recording, come on down to the collective. Thanks a lot.